My name is Sonia Gill. I'm 20 years old and I'm a paratrooper in the United States Army. But tonight, I wasn't a soldier. I was a target. I lay crumpled at the bottom of my family's staircase in Tucson, struggling to breathe past the two ribs my brother Leo had just cracked with his boot. When I shakily pulled out my phone to dial 911, my father, Frank, snatched it from my hand. "Don't you start your drama," he growled, his face flushed from Budweiser. From the kitchen, my mother, Karen, called out, her voice colder than the tile floor against my back. "For God's sake, Sonia, you always have to be the center of attention. Your brother didn't mean it." His "didn't mean it" was a shove from the top of the stairs and a deliberate kick. Their "didn't mean it" was my entire life. They didn't know that, through the pain, my mind was becoming terrifyingly clear. They had made a critical tactical error. They had trained a soldier to endure. And now she was going to teach them about consequences. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe if you've ever had your voice silenced in your own home. This story is for you. The scent of laundry detergent, that clean, artificial smell of a normal suburban Saturday, still clung to the air as I hauled the heavy basket up from the basement. Muscle memory from years of drills and ruck marches had made my movements efficient. Economical. There was no wasted energy in the way I moved through that house. My body was a tool, honed by the relentless discipline of the 101st Airborne. But here, in this quiet house in Tucson, Arizona, that discipline meant nothing. My brother Leo was sprawled on the sofa, a king on his threadbare throne, bathed in the flickering blue light of an NFL game. He was 2 years older, but in his world, time had stopped somewhere around his senior year of high school. He watched me approach, his eyes narrowed with the bored cruelty that was his default setting. As I passed, he casually stretched out his leg. It was a lazy, almost insignificant movement, but it was perfectly timed. My foot caught his ankle, and the heavy laundry basket tipped, sending a cascade of clean folded clothes tumbling across the floor. "Watch where you're going, you useless G.I. Jane," he grunted, not even bothering to look away from the screen. Before I could regain my balance, his hand shot out and shoved me, hard in the center of my chest. The world tilted. My mind, trained to process threats in milliseconds, became a slow-motion camera. It recorded the sensation of weightlessness, the rough texture of the wooden stair treads against my back as I tumbled down, the sickening thud of my body hitting each step. Thump, thump, thump. The final impact at the bottom knocked the air from my lungs in a painful gasp. Above the roaring in my ears, I heard Leo's grunt of satisfaction. "Serves you right." The pain was a white-hot flash in my side, a sharp stabbing sensation that made every breath an agony. But it was nothing compared to the shock. The push hadn't been an accident. It wasn't a clumsy mistake during a sibling squabble. It was deliberate, cold. He had wanted to hurt me. I lay there, helpless, listening to the disembodied cheers of the crowd from the television, a soundtrack to my private battlefield. The door to my father's den creaked open. Frank emerged, a half-empty bottle of Budweiser dangling from his hand. His eyes, clouded and indifferent, scanned the scene. Me, gasping on the floor, the scattered laundry, and Leo, who had already perfected a shrug of theatrical innocence. "What's all the racket?" he asked. But the question wasn't directed at me. It never was. "She tripped," Leo mumbled, his gaze still fixed on the game. My father nodded instantly. It was a familiar ritual, this blind acceptance of Leo's reality. The company he worked for, Gravora Group, had just given him the Employee of the Month award. The little plaque sat on the mantelpiece, a gleaming testament to his supposed integrity. The hypocrisy of it burned hotter than the pain in my ribs. I pushed myself up onto one elbow, gritting my teeth. "He pushed me," I managed to force out, the words scraping my throat. Frank waved a dismissive hand, a gesture I knew better than a hug. "Don't go blaming your brother. You're just clumsy." His words weren't a judgment, they were a verdict, one that had been handed down since we were children. In this house, my truth had no currency. That's when my mother, Karen, appeared at the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in her hand. She surveyed the scene with an air of profound irritation, as if I had deliberately spilled something on her clean floor. There was no flicker of concern in her eyes, no maternal instinct to rush to my side. Just annoyance. "What is it with you two?" she sighed. "Sonia, how many times have I told you not to provoke your brother?" She didn't ask if I was hurt. She didn't ask what happened. She assigned blame with the swift, unthinking efficiency of a machine. My pain was simply an inconvenience to her. My training kicked in. Assess the situation. You are injured. Seek aid. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. The numbers 911 seemed to glow. But as my thumb hovered over the call button, it was my mother who gave the order. A slight nod, a tightening of her lips. It was a signal to my father. He moved, snatching the phone from my grasp. "Put that away," my mother said, her voice sharp as shattered glass. "Are you trying to make the neighbors laugh at this family? Have you no shame?" Shame. The word hung in the air. The shame she spoke of wasn't for the violence, for the son who had just assaulted his sister, or for the husband who was enabling it. The shame was for the risk of it being exposed. It was for the disruption of their carefully constructed illusion of a normal, happy American family. Lying on that cold floor, listening to the muffled sounds of the game resuming and my mother starting to methodically stack dishes in the kitchen, something inside me shifted. The searing pain in my side began to fade into the background, replaced by an icy, crystalline clarity. My drill sergeant's voice echoed in my head, a tough-as-nails woman who had broken me down and rebuilt me into a weapon. "When you are ambushed, you do not panic. You assess the threat, you identify your objective, and you formulate a plan of counterattack." The threat wasn't just Leo's fists. It was my father's silence and my mother's words. The threat was the entire system they had built, a system designed to protect the golden boy and crush anyone who challenged the narrative. My objective wasn't revenge, it was justice. And the plan? The plan began to form in my mind, precise and ruthless as a military operation. I was no longer their victim. I was an intelligence officer, and this house was now my area of operations. They had underestimated me for the last time. Later that night, locked in my childhood bedroom, the sharp throb in my ribs settled into a dull, persistent ache. Every breath was a grim reminder of the impact against the stairs. Lying in the dark, I gently pressed my fingers against the tender flesh, feeling the deep bruise forming beneath the skin. This new injury was just a postscript, another entry in a long ledger of pain. The dull ache in my ribs was just an echo of a much older sting, a phantom pain from a scar I could still trace on my left forearm. My mind drifted back 12 years. I was 8 years old, and the Arizona sun felt like a warm blanket on my shoulders. My grandmother had just given me a brand new, bubblegum pink bicycle for my birthday, complete with shimmering tassels on the handlebars. I was wobbling down the sidewalk, my face a mixture of terror and exhilaration, finally getting the hang of balancing. Leo, who was 10, had been ignored for all of 10 minutes, and for him, that was an eternity. I saw the flash of jealousy in his eyes just before he darted off the porch. He didn't just bump into me. He lowered his shoulder and charged, a pint-sized linebacker aiming for a tackle. The world spun. The pink bike went one way, and I went the other, crashing into our neighbor's chain-link fence. A piece of jagged wire caught my arm, tearing through the skin. I remember the sight of the blood, so bright and red against my pale skin, and a pain so sharp it stole my breath. In the emergency room, the doctor, a kind man with tired eyes, gently cleaned the wound. "How did this happen, sweetie?" he asked. Before I could answer, my mother's hand clamped down on my shoulder, her fingers digging in just enough to be a warning. "She slipped," Karen said, her voice smooth as butter. "She's always been a bit clumsy." On the silent car ride home, my father delivered his part of the script from the rearview mirror. "If you breathe a word of this to anyone, you'll regret it." That night, I lay in this very bed, my arm throbbing with the fire of 12 stitches, and listened through the thin walls as my parents comforted Leo. He was the one crying, wailing about how scared he'd been when he saw the blood. They cooed and soothed him, telling him it wasn't his fault, that it was just an accident. My pain, the real, tangible wound on my arm, was invisible. The scar is still there today. A faint, silvery line. The first entry in my training manual for understanding the Gill family doctrine. My pain did not exist. That lesson was reinforced 10 years later, with a price tag of $10,000. At 18, I stood tall in the Army recruitment office, the scent of stale coffee and patriotism in the air. Signing that enlistment contract was the proudest moment of my life. The $10,000 signing bonus wasn't just money, it was my ticket out. It was a down payment on a future where I could be judged on my own merits, not by the long shadow cast by my brother. When the money hit my bank account, my parents called a family meeting. It felt less like a meeting and more like an ambush. Frank sat at the head of the dining table, speaking in the serious, authoritative voice he used as a plant supervisor, going on about shared responsibility. Karen wrung her hands, talking about helping your brother through a difficult time. They painted a picture of a family united, where one person's good fortune was everyone's. They convinced me to let them manage the funds for me, to put it in a joint savings account where it could be invested in the family's future. I was young, still clinging to the hope that my service might finally earn me a place at the table. So, I agreed. 2 weeks later, a dusty, beat-up Ford Ranger pickup truck appeared in our driveway. Leo tossed the keys in the air with a triumphant smirk. When I confronted my mother, her expression was one of polite confusion. "Your brother needs a vehicle to look for a job, Sonia," she said, as if explaining something to a simple child. "You should be happy for him." The truth, which I pieced together from hushed phone calls and frantic arguments I wasn't supposed to hear, was that Leo had racked up a significant gambling debt. My bonus, earned through the promise of my sweat and potentially my blood, hadn't been an investment. It had been a bailout. My sacrifice, the grueling months of basic training ahead of me, had been repackaged as a gift to the very person who had made my life a living hell. The map of their injustice had its landmarks, and the most painful one was always Thanksgiving. Last year, on my first leave from Fort Campbell, I came home wearing my dress uniform, naive enough to hope for a flicker of pride. Instead, the entire meal was an interrogation disguised as conversation. My father wanted to know about the Army's pension plan. My mother served slices of turkey with a side of passive aggression. "That nice Amy girl from next door is in law school," she'd said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "She'll make something of herself. What about you, Sonia? Still jumping out of planes?" Leo just snickered into his mashed potatoes and called me G.I. Jane. When I tried to share a story about a particularly challenging parachute jump, my father cut me off. "Enough of that. Tell us about your new job prospects, Leo." I sat there, a decorated soldier in my own home, feeling like a complete stranger, a failure in a uniform they refused to see. Now, in the darkness of my room, I slid out of bed and walked to my desk. My fingers found the small, smooth wooden box my grandmother had left me. It was the only thing of hers I had. I lifted the lid. Inside lay a small, worn Bible. I wasn't religious, but I held onto her words like scripture. I remembered the day she gave it to me, when I was 12. She looked me straight in the eye, her gaze clear and unwavering. "Sonia," she'd said, "there will be times when it feels like the whole world is against you, even the people who are supposed to love you. When that happens, you remember this. The truth is like the sun. You can hide it for a while, but it doesn't go away." Her voice was a beacon in the fog of my memory. Tonight, the clouds in the Gill house were darker than ever. But I knew where my son was. It wasn't in their approval or their acceptance. It was in the facts. It was in the medical reports, the audio files, the video evidence I was about to collect. My grandmother had told me my job was to clear the clouds. But how when you can't even get yourself to a doctor? The mission felt impossible. But for a soldier, impossible is just a starting point. 3 days after the attack, the dull ache in my side sharpened into something I could no longer ignore. A deep, grinding pain radiated from my ribs with every breath, every movement. I knew I needed a doctor, but it couldn't be a military one. A visit to the base hospital would create a military record, and my objective required civilian documentation. This was a civilian matter, and I needed civilian proof. That meant a trip to a local hospital, which also meant I needed a car. I found my father in the living room, exactly where I expected him to be, sunk into his recliner, bathed in the angry glow of Fox News. I stood in the doorway, keeping a tactical distance. "I need the keys to the Focus," I said, my voice flat and even. He didn't look up from the television. "Where are you going?" "I need to pick up a few things." It was a vague but plausible answer. From his bedroom down the hall, Leo's voice dripped with scorn. "She's probably going to buy more combat boots. What a drama queen." My father grunted, a sound that could mean anything from agreement to indifference. He reached into his pocket and tossed the keys onto the coffee table. They landed with a clatter that sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "Fill the tank before you bring it back," he commanded. "And don't be long. Leo needs the car to go look for a job." The lie was so casual, so effortless, it felt like a physical blow. Job hunting was their code word for Leo driving to the mall to waste time and money he didn't have. The Ford Focus, a car I had helped pay for with my own enlistment money, wasn't a family vehicle. It was a tool of control. A leash. And in that moment, they were making it perfectly clear who held it. I looked at the keys on the table, then I looked at my father's oblivious profile. I made a decision. I wouldn't play their game. I wouldn't depend on them for a single thing more. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the keys where they lay. I chose the harder path, the city bus. My drill sergeant's voice echoed in my head, a mantra I'd repeated during countless grueling marches. "Embrace the suck, Private." And that's what I did. I went online and found a hospital on the other side of town, Pima Medical Center, a place where the name Jill meant nothing. The bus stop was nearly a mile away. Under the searing 105-degree Tucson heat, the walk was a special kind of hell. The dry air burned my lungs, and every jarring step sent a fresh stab of pain through my side. Sweat soaked through my t-shirt as I watched air-conditioned cars glide past, their occupants sealed away in their own comfortable worlds. I finally reached the bus stop and sank onto the hot vinyl of the bench. The loneliness was overwhelming. The entire city was moving around me, living out their normal lives, going to work, picking up groceries, meeting friends. Meanwhile, I was on a covert mission in broad daylight, a solitary soldier fighting a war no one else could see. The bus finally arrived, hissing as it lowered itself to the curb, and I climbed aboard. The ride took over an hour, a slow rattling journey through unfamiliar neighborhoods. With each passing mile, I felt more and more like a ghost, completely detached from the world outside the grimy window. At the emergency room, I drew on my training to stay calm and focused. I wasn't a crying victim. I was a soldier giving a field report. The triage nurse listened patiently as I checked in. When I was finally led to an examination room, I waited for the doctor, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap. Dr. Williams was a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and kind, intelligent eyes. She listened without interruption as I stated the facts, keeping my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "My brother assaulted me. My parents prevented me from calling the police." She nodded, her expression unreadable, and ordered a set of x-rays. When she returned a short time later, she held the film up to the light, her face serious. "Private Gill," she said, her voice firm but compassionate. "You have 2 fractured ribs. The contusions on your side are consistent with a direct blow, exactly as you described." I stared at her, and the dam of composure I'd so carefully constructed finally broke. Not with a flood of tears, but with a single, profound wave of relief. For the first time, someone in a position of authority had looked at me, listened to my truth, and validated it. It wasn't an overreaction. It wasn't me being dramatic. It was a crime. In that sterile white room, her words were more powerful than any painkiller she could have prescribed. She had given me back a piece of my sanity. She treated my injuries and then handed me a thick, manila envelope. "This is a copy of your full medical report, including the x-rays and my official findings," she explained. "Keep it somewhere safe." Holding that envelope felt like holding a weapon. It had weight, it had power. This wasn't just paper, it was ammunition, it was the first round in the magazine I was preparing to load. The bus ride home felt different. As the sun set over the desert, casting long shadows across the landscape, I no longer felt alone. I felt a sense of purpose. I was a soldier on a mission. My family could control the house, the car, and the narrative within those four walls. But they couldn't control the truth. And I, Private Sonia Gill, had just launched my campaign to reclaim it. When I walked through the front door, Frank was still in his chair. "Where the hell have you been all day?" he grumbled. "Just taking a walk," I replied calmly. I walked past him without another word, went up the stairs to my room, and locked the door. I hid the envelope at the bottom of my duffel bag, beneath my neatly folded uniforms. The first objective was complete. The operation had officially begun. If you've ever had to fight a battle no one else could see, if you've ever had to find strength when you felt completely alone, please support this story with a like. And in the comments, just type a single word that describes what you think Sonia is feeling right now. Let's see how many of us have felt that same way. My new life revolved around a strict, self-imposed schedule. Early mornings were spent poring over legal precedents and civil statutes at the public library, gathering intelligence. Afternoons were consumed by the long, hot journey by bus for physical therapy appointments for my healing ribs. And in between, there was a mandatory stop, a small oasis of sanity in the desert of my life. A coffee shop near the bus station called The Daily Grind. It was a small, no-frills kind of place that smelled permanently of dark roast coffee and old newspapers. The man behind the counter was named Al. He was probably in his 60s, with a full head of silver hair, a quiet demeanor, and faded Marine Corps tattoos that snaked up his weathered arms. Al rarely said much, but he saw everything. He was a master of observation. From my usual table in the corner, I noticed how he noticed things. He saw the way I always sat with my back ramrod straight, a habit ingrained from years of military discipline, even when my face was etched with fatigue. He saw the way I never complained about the blistering heat or the chronically late city bus. I had become a regular, and my routine was simple. One large iced coffee, black, to nurse for the 45 minutes until my connection arrived. One afternoon, as I slid a crumpled dollar bill across the counter, Al simply pushed it back towards me with a calloused finger. "It's on the house today," he said, his voice a low rumble. He met my surprised gaze with a look of frank, unwavering respect. "Thank you for your service." The simple words hit me with the force of a physical impact. I was so stunned, I couldn't even form a reply. I just nodded, my throat suddenly tight. In my own home, my service was a liability, a source of ridicule, a punchline. Here, in a dusty coffee shop, a complete stranger was thanking me for it. I took my coffee back to my table, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something other than pain or anger. I felt seen. Slowly, over the following days, a quiet friendship began to form in the space of short, clipped conversations. Al never asked the questions I dreaded. Questions about my family, or why a paratrooper with the 101st Airborne was relying on public transportation. His curiosity was of a different, more respectful kind. He asked about my unit, about the C-130s I jumped from. He told me a few short, spare stories about his time in Vietnam, not about combat, but about the camaraderie, the shared hardship. A silent understanding grew between us, the kind that exists between people who have worn a uniform. He recognized the discipline in me, and I recognized the quiet strength in him. We didn't need to exchange life stories. We understood the basics just by the way we carried ourselves. One day, as I stood up to leave, I winced. A sharp, involuntary gasp as my ribs protested the movement. Al saw it. Without a word, he reached into the small freezer behind the counter, wrapped a handful of ice in a clean towel, and slid it onto the counter. "Here," he said simply. "Looks like you could use this." That small gesture of practical kindness, of addressing the need without asking the intrusive question, touched something deep inside me. It was a gesture of genuine care, not of pity or morbid curiosity. The stark contrast between this quiet haven and my life at home was thrown into sharp relief a few days later. I was sitting at my table, nursing my coffee, when my phone buzzed. It was my mother. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the ignore button before finally answering. Karen's voice was a blade of irritation. Sonia, where are you? The dishwasher is making that noise again. You need to come home and look at it. I don't know why you have to be wandering around all day. There was no hello, no how are you? Just a summons, a complaint. A reminder of my designated role as the family's resident, on-call technician. My existence was measured only by my utility to them. Yes, ma'am, I replied, my voice hollow. I ended the call and slumped back in my chair, the familiar weight of exhaustion settling over me. Al had been wiping down the counter nearby, and though he hadn't stared, I knew he'd heard. He walked over and placed a plate in front of me. On it was a perfectly golden grilled cheese sandwich, the cheese still bubbling at the edges. Eat, he said. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a quiet command. You look like you're about to fall over. I stared at the sandwich, that simple, quintessential American comfort food, and my eyes began to burn. The warmth radiating from the plate felt like the first real warmth I'd felt in weeks. I hadn't even realized how hungry I was, how depleted I'd become. I picked it up and took a bite. The melted American cheese, the buttery, crispy bread, it was the most profound meal I'd ever had. I ate slowly, deliberately, and for those 10 minutes, I felt completely and utterly safe. There were no judgments here, no unreasonable demands, just the quiet presence of a fellow soldier and the simple nourishment of a hot meal. When I finished, Al came by to clear the plate. Listen, soldier, he said, leaning against the table. Here's the deal. Anytime you need a safe harbor, you come here. You don't have to buy anything. You just show up. That's the code. He straightened up and gave me a slight nod. Soldiers look after their own. Doesn't matter the branch, doesn't matter the war. You see one in trouble, you step up. That night, when I returned to the cold, silent house that was supposed to be my home, something had fundamentally changed within me. The war I was fighting was still a lonely one, but I was no longer a solitary soldier. I had found an outpost. I had an ally. And that made all the difference in the world. The fragile peace I'd found at the daily grind made returning home each evening feel like crossing into enemy territory. Al's quiet respect and genuine kindness had recalibrated my sense of normal, making the suffocating atmosphere of my house all the more unbearable. But then, one evening, something shifted. The enemy waved a white flag. I walked into the warm, comforting scent of cinnamon and baked apples. My mother was pulling a homemade apple pie from the oven, the very same recipe she used to make for my birthday when I was a little girl. The air in the house, usually thick with tension, felt strangely light. At dinner, Frank actually asked me about my unit at Fort Campbell. Leo was sullen, but unusually silent. For a dangerous, fleeting moment, a tiny sliver of hope lodged itself in my chest. Maybe, a naive part of me whispered, maybe things could actually change. After dinner, Karen placed a generous slice of the warm apple pie in front of me, a dollop of vanilla ice cream melting on top. I know things have been tense lately, dear, she began, her voice dripping with a sweetness I hadn't heard in years. Your father and I have been talking. There's a night supervisor position opening up at Gravora Group. Your father thinks you'd be perfect for it. You could get an early discharge, come home, and start a career. We could be a family again, all of us together. The offer hung in the air, gleaming and beautiful. But I had been trained to recognize traps. This wasn't an olive branch, it was a gilded cage. They didn't want me back. They wanted control. They wanted to slot me back into my designated role in their broken system, where I was manageable, predictable, and useful to them. I politely deflected, telling them I had to honor my commitment to the Army. Their smiles tightened, but they let it go. For now. A few days later, they deployed their next weapon. The doorbell rang, and standing on our porch was Pastor Dave from Tucson Community Church, a man my parents had known for years. I was cornered, ushered into the living room for an impromptu chat. Sonia, he began, settling into my father's recliner with an air of paternal authority. Your parents are very worried about you. He folded his hands over his stomach. The Bible teaches us to honor our father and mother. As children, it is our duty to learn to forgive, even when we feel we have been wronged. He never once asked for my side of the story. He never asked if I was okay. The entire chat was a one-way sermon, a masterclass in gaslighting disguised as spiritual counsel. He skillfully reframed years of abuse as a simple misunderstanding and placed the heavy burden of forgiveness squarely on my shoulders. I sat there on the sofa, my hands clenched into fists in my lap, a silent, volcanic anger building inside me. This wasn't a reconciliation. It was a psychological ambush. I remembered a lecture from a SEER instructor about psychological warfare. The enemy will use your own values against you. They will speak of peace when they want you to lay down your arms. That's exactly what this was. The final piece of their strategy was revealed by accident. I was in the hallway upstairs when I heard my father on the phone in his den. His voice wasn't booming or authoritative, it was pleading. I understand, but the kid just needs a chance. Yes, I'm aware of the incident at the sports bar. No, I promise you, he's a changed man. The words hit me like a physical shock. My blood ran cold as I pieced it together. Leo. He had been rejected for a job, likely the very same supervisor position because of his criminal record. A bar fight he'd gotten into a few months back. The entire peace offering, the apple pie, the saccharine sweet talk, the intervention from Pastor Dave, it was all a lie. It was a coordinated campaign of manipulation. The job offer for me was just their desperate plan B to get Leo a foot in the door at Gravora, probably with me working alongside him, to supervise and keep him in line. My stomach turned. They hadn't tried to build a bridge. They had tried to use me as one. That evening, I confronted my mother in the kitchen. I kept my voice calm, my delivery precise. Why did you lie to me about the job? Trapped, Karen dropped the sweet mother facade instantly. Her face hardened, her eyes becoming cold, sharp chips of ice. Because that's what families do, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. We make sacrifices for each other. Your brother needed that help, and it is your duty to provide it. After everything we've done for you, it's time you started paying us back. Don't be so selfish, Sonia. Duty. Selfish. Those two words detonated in the quiet of the kitchen. My entire life, every sacrifice I had ever made, giving up my signing bonus, enduring the taunts, serving my country, had been reframed as a simple, transactional duty. My attempts to protect myself, to draw a line in the sand, were dismissed as selfishness. The years of simmering anger, the resentment I had swallowed down and compartmentalized like neatly packed gear, finally reached its boiling point. The soldier in me who had been patiently gathering intelligence was done. The paratrooper who had been waiting for the green light was now ready to jump. The quiet war was about to go loud. The breaking point didn't come with a roar of anger, but with the scent of charcoal and the forced laughter of a Sunday afternoon barbecue. My father, ever the diligent custodian of our family's image, had decided to host a small get-together with the neighbors. It was a performance piece, designed to showcase the Gills as the epitome of the happy suburban American family. I sat silently at the patio table, a prisoner of war forced to witness the enemy's propaganda campaign. The air was thick with the smell of grilling burgers and the cheerful drone of small talk. I was nursing a cold soda, counting the minutes until I could escape back to my room, when I saw my mother give Leo a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal, the green light. Leo, holding court near the grill with a beer in his hand, launched into a story. You guys remember that time we went to Disneyland? He began, his voice booming with false bonhomie. He proceeded to weave a hilarious, entirely fictional account of how I, at 10 years old, had thrown a massive temper tantrum over a lost balloon and single-handedly ruined the entire family vacation. He was a masterful storyteller, painting a vivid picture of a spoiled, dramatic little girl who had always been the source of the family's problems. The neighbors chuckled politely. My parents smiled, indulgent and weary, as if to say, "See what we have to put up with." I just sat there, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The story he was telling was a grotesque distortion of the truth. He conveniently left out the part where he had pushed me down a set of stairs near the haunted mansion, leaving me with a sprained ankle that had me hobbling for the rest of the trip. They weren't just abusing me in private anymore. They were now actively assassinating my character in public, poisoning the well, ensuring that if I ever spoke out, no one would believe me. It was a coordinated, tactical strike against my credibility. I stood up from the table. My movements were calm, deliberate. I didn't say a word. I simply turned and walked back inside the house. I heard his heavy footsteps behind me. "What's the matter, G.I. Jane?" Leo sneered, following me into the kitchen. He had that familiar, smug smile plastered on his face. "Can't take a little joke?" He blocked my path to the stairs. "You think you're so much better than us, don't you? Marching around in your little boy clothes, playing soldier." I tried to step around him, my eyes fixed on the staircase, my escape route. As I moved, his hand shot out and he slapped me across the face. The sound of it cracked through the air, sharp and ugly. The sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the kick to my ribs, but this was different. This wasn't about causing pain. This was about humiliation. It was the final, contemptuous dismissal of my humanity, the ultimate act of disrespect. But I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I didn't even recoil. I simply stopped and looked him dead in the eye. For the first time in his life, Leo saw something in my gaze that wasn't fear or pain. It was a vast, cold, terrifying emptiness. The part of me that had once been his little sister was gone. "You just made a mistake," I said, my voice eerily calm, each word perfectly level. Just then, Frank and Karen rushed in from the patio, ready to perform their roles in the tired, old play. "Sonia, what did you do now?" my father roared, his immediate assumption, as always, that I was the aggressor. But this time, I was rewriting the script. I raised my hand, palm out, a universal signal to stop. It was a gesture of such sudden, unexpected authority that all three of them froze in their tracks. "Enough," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the kitchen with the chilling precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "The game is over." I looked at each of them in turn, my gaze lingering for a moment on their shocked faces. "As of this second, I am no longer your daughter, and I am no longer your sister. I am a stranger living in this house. You will operate under new rules of engagement. Rule 1, do not speak to me. Rule 2, do not look at me. Rule 3, do not touch me." I took a step closer, my voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "If any of you violate this boundary, I promise you, you will face the full and undivided force of the United States legal system. Do you understand me?" A profound silence filled the room. They stared at me, mouths slightly agape, not at the threat, but at the transformation. The weak, compliant girl they had spent a lifetime molding was gone. In her place stood a soldier. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned my back on them, walked up the stairs with measured steps, and locked my bedroom door. There were no tears. There was no trembling. The time for emotion was over. I remembered a quote from General Patton. "Accept the challenges so that you can feel the exhilaration of victory." This was my challenge, and I was ready for my victory. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen cast a cool blue light on my determined face as I navigated to Amazon.com. My fingers flew across the keyboard. 3 miniature security cameras. Add to cart. 1 voice-activated audio recorder. Add to cart. 1 high-capacity external hard drive. Add to cart. Operation Overwatch was officially a go. The enemy combatants had been identified. The area of operations had been established. It was time to gather intelligence. This was the moment Sonia decided to fight back. If you are cheering for her right now, hit that like button to show your support. And in the comments, type the words, "Game on," if you are ready to see what happens next. Your support means the world to everyone who has ever had to draw a line in the sand. The Amazon package arrived not at our front door, but at a secure Amazon locker near Al's coffee shop. My new routine now included a quick stop to retrieve my supplies. Inside the plain brown box was the arsenal for my silent war. 3 cameras, no bigger than sugar cubes, a recording device disguised as an ink pen, and a terabyte of encrypted storage. That night, long after the house fell into a restless silence, Operation Overwatch commenced. I moved through the darkness of my own home like an infiltrator, every footstep silent, every movement precise. The muscle memory of night operations in training served me well. I was a ghost, mapping out sightlines and dead zones. The first camera, cleverly designed to look like a USB phone charger, went into an outlet in the kitchen. Its lens had a perfect wide-angle view of the stove and the main counter, the primary conflict zones. The second, a tiny pinhole camera, was tucked into the dense leaves of a fake fiddle-leaf fig tree in the living room, its gaze fixed on the base of the stairs and the front door. The final piece of equipment, the recorder pen, went into my pocket. It would be my constant companion. Back in my room, I networked the devices to a secure, password-protected cloud server. I encrypted the files. This house was no longer their sanctuary. It was my area of operations. As I watched the grainy, black-and-white feeds appear on my laptop screen, I thought of the movie Zero Dark 30. I wasn't hunting a terrorist, but I felt a strange kinship with the main character, Maya. Her obsessive, relentless pursuit of a target based on painstaking intelligence gathering. My family thought this was a domestic dispute. They had no idea they were now under surveillance. For 2 weeks, an uneasy truce settled over the house. I adhered strictly to my own rules of engagement, moving through the shared spaces like a phantom. My silence, my refusal to engage, infuriated them more than any argument ever could. They were itching for a fight, and I knew I needed to give them one. I needed a catalyst. The opportunity came when I overheard Leo on the phone, complaining about another failed job interview. His rage was a coiled snake, looking for something to strike. I chose that moment to go downstairs and make myself a sandwich. I moved with a calm deliberateness, opening and closing the refrigerator, taking out bread, knowing his eyes were on me. As predicted, he stormed into the kitchen. "Must be nice," he spat, "doing nothing all day while the rest of us are trying to make something of ourselves." I didn't look at him. I kept my voice cool, almost bored, a calculated provocation. "Your career isn't my responsibility, Leo." That was all it took. His rage exploded. He lunged forward, grabbed my hand, and slammed it down flat onto the hot electric stove burner, which he'd just been using to heat a can of soup. A searing, white-hot pain shot up my arm. I bit down a scream, yanking my hand back as the smell of burnt flesh filled the air. Frank and Karen rushed in, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on?" Frank demanded. "She burned herself for attention," Leo shouted, his face a mask of righteous indignation. My mother rushed to his side, not mine. "Oh, Leo, don't upset yourself." Through the agony, a cold sense of triumph washed over me. I looked past them, towards the faint red light of the USB charger plugged into the wall. Every word, every action had been captured. Perfect, undeniable proof. The incident made me realize the camera in the living room had a blind spot. I needed a better angle. I decided to move it, hiding it inside a hollowed-out book on the main bookshelf. The next afternoon, while everyone was out, I set to work. As I was carefully threading the thin power cord behind the shelves, I heard the jingle of keys at the front door. My heart hammered against my ribs. Karen was home early. There was no time to run. Acting on pure instinct, I shoved the camera and wires into the book, slapped it back on the shelf, and dove behind the large, overstuffed sofa. I lay flat on the floor, holding my breath, my face pressed into the dusty carpet. I heard her footsteps enter the room, just a few feet from where I was hiding. I could hear her sigh with annoyance. "This house is always such a mess," she muttered to herself before her footsteps receded up the stairs. I stayed there for 5 long minutes, my pulse roaring in my ears, before creeping back to my room. The mission was more dangerous than I had anticipated. The final, definitive piece of evidence came, as it so often does, from something utterly trivial. Leo opened the refrigerator, looking for his carton of oat milk. It was empty. "That bitch drank all my milk," he roared, the fury in his voice completely disproportionate to the offense. His rage escalated with terrifying speed. He stormed down to the basement and returned a moment later brandishing an aluminum baseball bat. I'm going to smash your empty skull in, he screamed, his eyes wild. He stalked towards me where I stood in the kitchen doorway. This time, I didn't move. I didn't flinch. My heart was pounding, but my face was a mask of calm neutrality. I was the canary in the coal mine, and the camera was my witness. He swung the bat not at me, but at the wall right next to my head. The impact was deafening. Drywall dust exploded into the air. Frank and Karen ran in. My father's eyes went straight to the gaping hole in the wall. "What the hell did you do?" he yelled at Leo, his only concern being the property damage. My mother, true to form, rushed to comfort the aggressor. "It's okay, baby. Calm down," she cooed to my 22-year-old brother. My voice was cold and steady. He just attacked me with a weapon. My father turned to me then, his face a thundercloud of denial. He looked me straight in the eye and delivered the lie that would seal their fate. "I don't see a bat." And in that moment, as I stared at the aluminum bat still clutched in my brother's hand, I knew I had won. The day I presented my evidence, I chose my armor carefully. I didn't wear a victim's clothes. I wore the uniform of a soldier. My Army service uniform, the formal Class A's, was perfectly pressed, my ribbons and medals aligned with geometric precision. As I walked into the Pima County District Attorney's office, I remembered my oath: to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The enemies I was fighting now were domestic, but the oath felt just as relevant. I didn't enter the office of DA Janet Morrison as a tearful young woman seeking pity. I walked in as a soldier, delivering an intelligence brief. I laid out the facts of my case chronologically, my voice calm and measured, detailing each event from the fall down the stairs to the baseball bat incident. I presented the medical report from Dr. Williams, and then I placed the small black external hard drive on the center of her polished desk. "This is the evidence," I said. Morrison, a sharp professional woman in her 50s, exchanged a look with her team. They gathered around a monitor, and I watched as they played the first file, the kitchen camera feed of Leo shoving my hand onto the hot stove. A stunned silence fell over the room. I could see the shift in their expressions, from professional detachment to visible horror. Morrison looked up from the screen, not at me, but to me. The pity was gone, replaced by something else: sheer, unadulterated respect. "Private Gill," she said, her voice filled with a new intensity. "You're not just a victim, you're an outstanding investigator." I had already moved out by the day the warrants were served. I was staying in a small anonymous motel across town. The first call came from my mother. Her voice was a hysterical shriek on the other end of the line. "Sonia, what have you done? The police are here. They're taking your brother. You're destroying this family." I held the phone away from my ear, my own voice as cold and hard as steel. "No, ma'am," I replied. "I'm just bringing the truth into the light." And then I hung up. In the weeks leading up to the trial, their lawyer tried to cut a deal, a plea bargain. They offered a formal apology and a monetary settlement if I agreed to drop the charges. Through DA Morrison, my answer was swift and absolute. My mission is not yet complete. Their panic was palpable. For the first time in their lives, the puppet had cut her own strings, and they had no idea what to do. The courtroom was a sterile, intimidating space, but I felt strangely calm. Their defense attorney, a slick man with an expensive suit, tried to paint me as a jealous, overly dramatic younger sister. He leaned forward on the witness stand, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ms. Gill, isn't it true that you and your brother have always engaged in a bit of roughhousing? That this was all just a series of harmless sibling squabbles?" I looked directly at the jury, then back at him. "No, sir," I said, my voice clear and ringing through the silent courtroom. "They were assaults." And then DA Morrison began to play the videos. The first clip showed Leo slamming my hand onto the stove. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. I saw Leo's smug, confident expression melt into a pasty, white mask of shock. He sank lower in his chair, refusing to look at the screen. Then came the second clip, the baseball bat. The jury watched in horrified silence as Leo screamed, "I'm going to smash your empty skull in." They saw him swing the aluminum bat, the explosion of drywall next to my head. They saw Frank and Karen rush in, and then they heard my father's voice, clear as day, delivering the lie that would condemn them all. I don't see a bat. I watched the jury. I saw a middle-aged woman shake her head in disgust. I saw a man who looked like a retired construction worker clench his jaw, his eyes fixed on my father with undisguised contempt. In that moment, the fortress of lies my family had spent a lifetime building crumbled into dust before a jury of their peers. The final blow, however, came from an unexpected direction. D.A. Morrison called her final witness, Al, from the Daily Grind. He walked to the stand with the quiet dignity of an old Marine, his back straight, his jaw set. He spoke in a low, steady voice, telling the court about the young soldier who came into his shop every day, who always sat up straight despite the exhaustion on her face, who never once complained. He described seeing me come in with fresh bruises, the way I would wince in pain when I thought no one was looking. The defense attorney tried to discredit him. "Sir, you're not a doctor. You have no idea how she got those bruises." Al looked at the attorney, then at the jury. "In the Marine Corps, we have a saying," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "Actions speak louder than words. I can't tell you what happened in that house. I can only tell you what I saw. I saw a soldier in distress, fighting a war all by herself." The jury was out for less than an hour. When they filed back in, their faces were grim, resolved. I held my breath as the foreman handed the verdict to the bailiff. "On the charge of felony assault against Leo Gill, we the jury find the defendant." A pause. "Guilty." "On the charges of obstruction of justice against Frank Gill and Karen Gill, we the jury find the defendants." "Guilty." The word "guilty" brace, repeated 3 times, was like a series of controlled detonations, bringing the final wall of their world crashing down. I watched, dispassionately, as their faces registered shock, disbelief, and finally, panic. As the bailiffs moved in with handcuffs, Leo's head snapped up. He looked across the courtroom, his eyes finally finding mine. The arrogance, the cruelty, the years of smug superiority were gone. In their place was something I had never seen before: fear. He finally understood. He hadn't been fighting with his clumsy little sister. He had picked a fight with a paratrooper from the 101st Airborne, and he had lost. After the verdict, the house felt cavernous. The silence that fell wasn't the tense, watchful silence of before. It was the vast, empty silence of a crater after an explosion. The adrenaline of the fight, the sharp focus of the mission, had all evaporated, leaving behind a profound and bone-deep exhaustion. The exhilarating feeling of victory was gone, replaced by something heavier, more complicated. I spent the next few days walking through the rooms of my childhood home like a tourist in a foreign country. Everything was exactly as it had been, yet nothing was the same. There was Frank's worn leather recliner, still molded to the shape of his body. There was Karen's collection of porcelain plates, hanging pristinely on the dining room wall. There was Leo's dusty high school football trophy on the mantelpiece. They were no longer just household objects. They were artifacts in a museum to a life that was now officially over. I had won the war, but the battlefield was my own past. And the price of victory was everything I'd ever known as family. One evening, I sat on the back steps, watching the Arizona sky bleed from fiery orange to deep indigo. The desert air cooled around me. And for the first time since that night at the bottom of the stairs, I allowed myself to cry. It wasn't a loud, hysterical cry, but a quiet, steady stream of tears for the family I'd wished for the little girl who had tried so hard to be good enough, and for the simple, painful truth that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let go of everything. A few days later, while sorting through a pile of junk mail, I found a handwritten letter. The return address was in Oregon. It was from my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, whom I hadn't seen since I was a child. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Her cursive was neat, her words chosen carefully. She wrote that she had read about the trial in the news online, and then she apologized. "I always knew something was wrong, Sonia," she wrote. "I saw the way Frank controlled everything, the way your mother worshipped the ground Leo walked on. I saw bruises on you as a little girl that didn't make sense. But I was a coward. I was afraid of your father, and I kept my mouth shut. Please forgive my silence. What you did took a kind of courage I never had. You didn't just do it for you did it for everyone who was too afraid to speak up. I am so incredibly proud of you. The letter was both a comfort and a knife to the heart. It was a validation from someone who had been there, a confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that the toxicity was real. But it was also a tragic testament to the destructive power of silence. Her pride in me felt good, but it was bittersweet, a sad reminder of how long the truth had been buried. Before my flight back to Fort Campbell, I knew there was one last thing I had to do. I drove to the Pima County Jail. I didn't see them together. I saw them one by one, through the thick, smeared glass of the visitation booth. Frank went first. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He just stared at the wall behind me, muttering about how I'd ruined his reputation at work, how I had destroyed everything he had built. He spoke only of himself. There was no remorse, no acknowledgement of the truth. Karen was next. She cried, of course. The tears were her weapon of choice, and she wielded them with expert precision. She spoke of forgiveness, of how family is supposed to stick together, no matter what. It was the same manipulative script she had used her entire life, right up to the very end. Last was Leo. Stripped of his arrogance and bravado, he looked smaller in the baggy orange jumpsuit, just a lost, pathetic boy. He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with genuine, bewildered confusion. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this to us?" I looked at the man who had been my brother, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger, no hatred. Just a vast, empty space where a sister's love used to be. "Because it was the right thing to do," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You were a threat." And I neutralized the threat. On the plane back to Kentucky, as the aircraft climbed high above the clouds, I thought about the word forgiveness. I realized that forgiving them didn't mean forgetting what they did. It didn't mean condoning their actions. And it certainly didn't mean letting them back into my life. I wouldn't be forgiving them for their sake. I would be doing it for mine. I chose to forgive their weakness, their cruelty, their profound blindness. Not because they deserved it, but because I deserved to be free. I refused to carry the crushing weight of their toxicity with me for the rest of my life. As I read a book on the flight, a quote from Maya Angelou seemed to jump off the page. I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better. It was a revelation. I could forgive myself for taking so long to fight back. My own journey was one of learning and growing. Looking out the small window, I watched the sprawling city of Tucson shrink until it was just a patchwork of lights in the vast desert below. I was leaving the battlefield behind. My mission was complete. Now it was time to begin a new one, rebuilding my own life. My new life began not with a bang, but with the quiet scrape of a paintbrush against a wall. After honorably completing my enlistment, rising to the rank of sergeant, I knew my path was no longer in the sky, jumping out of planes. The war I had won at home had forged a new mission for me on the ground. Using the benefits of the GI Bill, I applied to law school. To my own surprise, I was accepted into the University of Arizona. So, I came back. I returned to Tucson, not as a victim running from her past, but as a survivor returning to reclaim her future. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment near the campus, a place that was entirely my own. The first thing I did was buy a can of paint, a soft, calming color called sky blue. As I rolled the color over the drab beige walls, I felt like I was painting over the grayness of my past. This little apartment, with its newly blue walls, was the first truly safe space I had ever had. One afternoon, driven by nostalgia, I found myself back at the daily grind. Al was still there, behind the counter, a little grayer at the temples, but just as solid and steadfast as I remembered. He looked up as I walked in, and a rare, genuine smile broke across his face. "Well, I'll be," he rumbled. "You look different, Sergeant." I smiled back, a real smile that reached my eyes. "No, Al," I said. "This is finally me." I told him about law school, about my plans. He just nodded slowly, his eyes full of a quiet pride that meant more to me than any official commendation. He poured me a cup of coffee, on the house, of course. I knew you were destined for great things, he said, pushing the mug across the counter. Some people fight their wars overseas. Some of us fight them right here at home. Every battleground is important. His simple validation felt more significant than any medal I could have earned. That first Christmas in law school, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I signed up to volunteer at a local women's shelter, a safe house for victims of domestic violence. I didn't go there to tell my story. I went there to listen. For hours, I sat in the common room, listening to the quiet, halting stories of other women, women who had been made to feel crazy, invisible, and worthless. I didn't offer advice or platitudes. I just listened, and I validated their pain. And to each and every one of them, I offered the simple words I had once so desperately needed to hear myself. It's not your fault. That night, walking back to my quiet, blue-walled apartment, a profound sense of peace washed over me. I realized that my pain, once a source of unbearable shame, had been transformed. It was no longer a weapon used against me, but a bridge I could use to connect with and help others. My legacy wasn't going to be vengeance. It was going to be healing. Years passed. The law school grind gave way to the bar exam, which in turn gave way to a new uniform. I had joined the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the Army's legal arm. I was no longer a paratrooper, I was a lawyer. The story comes full circle to today. I'm Captain Sonia Gill, and I'm sitting in my office on base. The nameplate on my desk is solid, real. Across from me sits a young private first class, her eyes wide with the same fear I once knew so well. She's twisting her hands in her lap, her voice barely a whisper as she tells a terrifyingly familiar story. An abusive husband, also in the military. And a chain of command that is telling her to handle it at home. When she finishes, a tear slips down her cheek. She looks at me, her expression pleading, expecting disbelief or dismissal. I lean forward, my gaze steady and unwavering. And I give her the one thing I never had. I give her my belief. Private, I say. And my voice is everything I ever needed to hear. Firm, compassionate, and absolute. I believe you, and I will fight for you. You are not alone in this fight. A flicker of hope ignites in her eyes, the first light in a long darkness. As she leaves my office, clutching the resources and legal paperwork I've given her, she stands a little taller. I turn and look out my office window. I've come a long way from the cold, hard floor at the bottom of that staircase. I completed the most dangerous mission of my life. I survived my own family. And in doing so, I found a new, more profound mission. Now, every single day, I get to make sure that no soldier, no matter their rank or their battle, ever has to fight alone. The mission continues. My story began on a cold floor, feeling invisible and unheard. Today it ends with a promise, to see and hear others. The journey from victim to advocate is a difficult one, but it's a path no one should have to walk alone. If this story touched you, please consider sharing it. You never know who might need to receive this message as a lifeline, a sign that they are not alone and that there is hope. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel, where we share stories that empower and heal. Thank you for listening. Remember, your story matters. Your voice deserves to be heard.